Welcome to Sleepscape. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. If there's a story that you'd like for me to tell, feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it. In 1974, a woman named Doris Bither was living with her children in a small, rundown house on Braddock Street in Culver City, California. The home itself was in poor condition, reportedly condemned by the city more than once, yet it was still being occupied. It wasn't a place most people would choose to live, but for Doris, it was what she could afford. At the time, she was raising multiple children on her own while dealing with financial hardship, and a life that had already been shaped by long-term stress and personal instability. Everything about her situation suggested pressure, and that pressure would later become a key part of how her story was interpreted. What began happening inside that house would eventually become one of the most debated paranormal cases ever recorded. The earliest disturbances were relatively subtle. Doris described objects shifting out of place, doors opening and closing without explanation, and occasional glimpses of human-like shapes that seemed to disappear the moment she tried to focus on them. These figures weren't described as solid, but more like outlines, present enough to notice, but not fully there. At first, the events were unsettling but still easy to dismiss or rationalize. Over time, that changed. According to Doris, the activity became more focused and deliberate, gradually shifting from environmental disturbances to something that felt targeted. She claimed that whatever was inside the house was interacting with her directly. In multiple accounts, she described being physically restrained while lying in bed, unable to move her arms or legs as if they were being held in place. She spoke about pressure against her body and the sensation of being pinned down. She believed there were multiple presences involved, two smaller figures and a third that seemed larger and more dominant. These claims would later become the most disturbing part of the case, and also the most controversial, drawing both intense belief and strong skepticism. The case might have remained unknown if not for a chance encounter. In August of 1974, a man named Cary Gaynor was in a bookstore near UCLA discussing his work as a volunteer in a parapsychology lab. The lab, led by Dr. Thelma Moss, was focused on studying unusual phenomenon using a more structured, research-based approach. As Gaynor spoke, Doris approached him and introduced herself. She told him her house was haunted and that the activity had become violent. Gaynor took her information and brought it back to the lab, where he worked with researcher Barry Taff. After hearing the details, Taff agreed to visit the home. When they arrived, their initial reaction was not what Doris had hoped for. The house was in severe disrepair, and the overall environment raised immediate concerns. After listening to her describe the events, especially the more extreme claims, Taff's first impression was that she might be dealing with a psychological issue rather than a paranormal one. They spoke with her briefly, asked questions, and ultimately decided not to pursue the case further at that time. Instead, they recommended that she seek professional help and left the property. About 10 days later, Doris reached out again. This time, her story had changed in a way that was harder to dismiss. She reported that neighbors had begun experiencing similar disturbances in their own homes, strange noises, unexplained movement, and events they couldn't account for. This detail shifted the situation. If the activity was no longer isolated to Doris alone, it suggested something broader might be happening. That was enough to bring the investigators back for a second visit. When they returned, they immediately noticed something unusual that hadn't stood out before. There was a smell in the house that seemed to come and go without warning. When it appeared, it was strong and unmistakable, similar to the odor of something decomposing. The investigators searched for a source, checking under the house, inside the walls, and through the plumbing, but nothing explained it. The smell would simply appear, linger briefly, and then disappear again. It was the middle of summer in California, and the house had no air conditioning. The inside felt hot, heavy, and stagnant. But when Doris led them into her bedroom, the temperature changed instantly. The room felt cold, far colder than it should have been compared to the rest of the house. There was no visible explanation for it. Barry Taff would later describe the sensation as stepping into a completely different environment. According to Doris, this room was where most of the activity occurred, and standing there, the investigators began to reconsider their earlier assumptions. Only a short time later, they witnessed something they could not easily explain. A cabinet door opened on its own, and a frying pan moved out of the cupboard and through the air before hitting the floor. There was no one else in the room and no clear cause. That moment marked the beginning of a full investigation that would continue for several weeks and involve a large number of observers, including students, researchers, and photographers. During that time, the house was rarely empty. At times, more than 20 people were present, attempting to observe and document whatever was happening. Reports continued of objects moving, doors shifting, and sounds echoing through the home. But the most unusual phenomenon described by multiple witnesses involved small, glowing lights. These lights were often described as yellow-green orbs that moved through the rooms in unpredictable ways. They didn't behave like reflections or outside light sources. Instead, they appeared to move with direction, changing speed and path, without any clear pattern. In some cases, investigators believed the lights reacted to people in the room. On one occasion, a researcher spoke aloud and asked the light to move away from the wall, and it appeared to change direction and reposition itself in response. While this was not considered definitive proof of anything, it added to the growing sense that the activity was not random. Attempts were made to photograph the phenomenon, but the results were inconsistent. Instead of capturing clear images, the photographs often showed streaks or arcs of light, which skeptics later attributed to camera exposure issues or movement during the shot. Even so, the people present insisted that what they saw in person did not match what appeared on film. One of the most widely reported moments of the investigation involved the lights gathering together in one area of the room. Multiple witnesses claimed that instead of scattering, the lights seemed to merge, forming the outline of a larger shape. According to those accounts, the shape resembled the upper portion of a human figure. It was described as incomplete and short-lived, appearing briefly before disappearing again. As with many other events in the case, no clear photographic evidence captured what witnesses claimed to have seen. In another incident, Doris indicated that an unseen presence was in the room even though no one else could see it. Investigators attempted to document it using a Polaroid camera. Several photos taken during that moment came out heavily overexposed, showing little to no detail. However, when additional photos were taken moments later after she said the presence was gone, they appeared normal. While this inconsistency raised questions, it did not provide a clear answer. As the investigation continued, a pattern began to emerge. The intensity of the activity appeared to fluctuate, often increasing during periods of emotional stress and decreasing when conditions were calmer. This observation led Barry Taff to consider an alternative explanation. Rather than a traditional haunting, he began to explore the possibility that the events could be the result of psychokinetic activity, something being generated unconsciously by Doris herself. Eventually, Doris moved out of the house. For a short period, the activity seemed to stop, but according to reports, it began again after she relocated. Neighbors in the new area described similar disturbances, even though they were unaware of her past experiences. The investigators visited again and documented additional unexplained events, including objects moving and unusual sounds captured on audio recordings. In one instance, a vase was reportedly thrown across a room during a recording session. When the audio was reviewed later, it appeared to include the sound of footsteps approaching the recording device before abruptly cutting off. As with other elements of the case, the recording raised more questions than answers. Over time, the activity gradually faded. Doris moved again, and eventually the reports stopped altogether. What remained was a case filled with conflicting interpretations. Some believed it represented a genuine paranormal event, supported by the number of witnesses who claimed to have seen unusual phenomena firsthand. Others argued that the case could be explained by psychological factors, environmental conditions, and limitations in how the investigation was conducted. The story would later gain widespread attention after inspiring the book and film The Entity, though those versions took significant creative liberties. Separating documented events from dramatized storytelling became increasingly difficult as the case grew more well-known. To this day, there is no single explanation that accounts for everything that was reported. Whether the events were the result of something external, something psychological, or a combination of both remains uncertain. What is clear is that those involved believe they experienced something real, something they could not fully explain, and that uncertainty is what continues to make the case so unsettling.